I don't know how many people here can remember as far back as the 2008 financial crisis. It almost kind of seems lost to the mists of time a little bit now, doesn't it? We already talk about the COVID years as if they were some kind of distant bad dream, and that was only like 5-6 years ago. But long before that, the big event of the 2000s was the crash of the American housing market and the global recession that followed. Now, I certainly don't reference it lightly. There may be people sitting here that were affected by it. I certainly met people back in the day who really struggled financially because of it. But I guess for the benefit of the younger generation amongst us, or people who haven't seen the film The Big Short, American banks in the mid-2000s were handing out mortgages like Maltesers, effectively, to people who couldn't pay them back, under the assumption that house prices would continue to increase, and these mortgages were bundled together and sold all over the world to foreign investors. And for reasons known only to people who understand economics, the house prices stopped rising, the bubble burst, and global chaos followed. And right in the eye of the storm was an investment bank called the Lehman Brothers. Now, the Lehman Brothers were an American institution, effectively. They'd been around for about 150 years, and for Americans at least, it was impossible to not imagine them not being there. The British equivalent, I guess, would be something like Marks and Spencer's or NatWest. Companies like that kind of exist permanently in our minds, don't they? And I guess subtly, the longer something's been around, the more trustworthy it becomes. And this was certainly the case for the Lehman Brothers, or so people thought. Even as late as the mid-2000s, they were heralded as a safe bet, as profitable, as reliable. Economic experts, news outlets, all went along with it. But as things started to turn, it became clear, more and more clear, that they were built on hollow foundations. They tried their best to hide it, they shuffled things around, they misled investors, they did their best to hold on to this veneer of trustworthiness. But underneath it all, they were rotting from the inside out. And they eventually filed for bankruptcy on the 15th of September 2008. America's fourth largest investment bank disappeared effectively overnight. So why am I banging on about banks? Well, in a roundabout kind of way, as we come to consider this text from Mark chapter 11, what I think we have in front of us at its core is Jesus declaring the spiritual bankruptcy of another famous, long-standing, supposedly reliable institution, the Jerusalem temple. And I guess, like the Lehman Brothers, if you were a Jew around this time, the temple was kind of as permanent as you could get. Now, granted, they were already on temple number 2 by this point. The first one had been destroyed, but that was kind of 500-600 years before this. And the one we have in front of us today had just undergone a massive refurbishment. But Jesus, via this visual illustration of the withered fig tree, is going to expose the hollow, rotten foundations of the temple, and more specifically, the people in charge of it. Now again, Ash touched on this last week with the text he was preaching on from Luke 13, but we're seeing another example of Jesus at perhaps his most confrontational, possibly even confusing. This is not the gentle Jesus, meek and mild, that we're used to seeing. But as is so often the case throughout the Gospels, this is a message laced with hope. It might not be immediately apparent, but out of the ashes of the old temple system is going to come a phoenix and a message that we can derive hope from. So let's dive in a little bit more detail. I've gone slightly non-traditional for today. I've got 4 points. For the first 3, we'll just divide the text up into 3 sections, have a look at what's going on, and then just a short point of application at the end. So for our first point, we'll just take verses 12 to 14 and look at the illustration of the fig tree itself. So just come back with me briefly. If we can get the text behind me, that'd be great. The next day, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. And when he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. Then he said to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard him say it. So, for an unprecedented second week running, we're on the subject of fig trees. Ash talked about the parable of the fig tree from Luke 13 last week. I think Jude made a valiant attempt in Kids Club to try and get them to eat figs, with mixed success. Okay, we'll leave it at that. But this week we've got a live action fig tree to consider, if you like, as Jesus and his disciples encounter one as they're walking out of Bethany. And it has the appearance, at least, that it's about to bud and produce fruit. Now, I know almost nothing about plants or gardening or horticulture in general, let alone fig trees. I am far from the most qualified person to talk about this. If I'm being brutally honest, I didn't even know figs grew on trees. If someone had told me that, figs sprout out of the ground like turnips, I'd have probably believed them. I'm certainly not, I'm not Alan Tishmarsh, it's fair to say, but I'm grateful for scholars and writings and historians that we can draw on to try and explain some of the significance of figs and fig trees in this story. I don't want to spend too much time on the kind of history of this, but I'm slightly concerned that if we don't spend any, this text may come across as slightly confusing. So let's just briefly try and put some meat on the bones. So the Old Testament is littered with references to figs and fig trees. And as the disciples walked along behind Jesus, it's safe to assume that the fig tree would have represented something more significant to them than just food. Way back in Deuteronomy chapter 8, as the wandering Hebrews survey the promised land before going into it, God says to them that the land is good because it has, amongst other things, fig trees. Figs were a sign of God's sustenance and provision, of his blessing. They were symbols of peace and equity. There's a lovely phrase that pops up a few times in the Old Testament: every man under his own fig tree. Roughly translated, meaning everyone has what they need. God has provided for everyone. There's no threat, there's no falling out, because God has blessed the people with figs. Equally, when the people strayed, when they broke their covenant relationship with God, the imagery in the Old Testament that we get is figs being removed, they wither, or God takes them away. Simply put, figs at times throughout Israel's history go hand in hand with the presence or absence of God's blessing. They symbolize something of his relationship with his people. And from Jesus' time all the way back through history, what was the primary way that God shared in relationship with his people? It was through the temple, through the sacrificial system. This is why thousands upon thousands of pilgrims from different countries have descended on Jerusalem in this chapter for the Passover. Normal population of Jerusalem around this time was about 40,000. And some estimates reckon that the number swelled to over 100,000 at this time of year. People from all over Asia Minor come to the temple. Why? To receive the figs of God's blessing, if you like. So when Jesus approaches the fig tree, i.e. the temple, the thing that's supposed to produce the figs, the thing that's supposed to be a conduit for God's blessing, what does he find? Leaves. In other words, the appearance of life, the appearance of success, people buzzing around the temple, pilgrims everywhere, money changers, people selling doves, but no fruit, no substance, a hollow foundation. Foundation not built on bringing people to experience God and share in relationship with him. And Jesus is going to expose it for what it is. Now, you might think that sounds harsh. The text clearly tells us that it's not the season for figs. How can Jesus possibly expect to find figs on a fig tree out of season? Well, again, from what I understand from people that know about horticulture, at this time of year, there should at least have been some early shoots of figs, even a few small signs of life. But Jesus finds nothing. It's not merely a case of bad timing, it's the fact that the tree is fundamentally incapable of bearing fruit regardless of the time of year. It's so far gone that the chance of finding fruit on it has long since passed. The capacity for the old temple religious system to purvey God's blessing to the people is slipping away. And the only solution now is to uproot it. Now, I need to be very clear about something here. I'm saying the temple was rotting from underneath, but I'm definitely not saying that this was because there was something wrong with the temple system in and of itself. Far from it. Think of it a little bit more like this. I don't know if anyone can remember that really rare, valuable painting of Jesus that needed restoring a few years ago, and whoever tried to restore it ended up making it look like a child's finger painting. It completely ruined it. Something that was once beautiful, marred by human intervention. There's no salvaging it now. The only thing left to do is put it in the bin. This is the kind of vibe we get from this text. It's tragic, but necessary. The blueprint needs to be ripped up. The people need something better than a temple system, a religious system marred by human beings. So let's move on. Secondly, Jesus enters the temple itself. If we skip on to verse 15. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." So this little section is what I like to call a full bingo card passage, Bible passage, i.e. it appears in all four of the Gospels. I imagine because it made quite a few headlines. John's account differs quite significantly from the other three Gospels. We don't have time to explore this now, but it's possible Jesus did this more than once. And at first glance, this little section seems quite a strange combination of events. From what I can work out, Jesus walks into the temple, effectively starts a fight with a bunch of tradesmen, and then launches into an impromptu sermon. So if you look at verse 17, it says, "As he taught them." The implication being that the pile of overturned tables and scared-looking money changers was some kind of illustration for his message. And then if you follow Matthew's account, Jesus then proceeds to start healing people. Quite the spectrum of things going on here. Maybe he heals some of the people who got hit by the tables he was throwing, who knows. But as we consider this little section, I think it might be beneficial just to do a bit of kind of myth busting, if you like. Because I think we need to be honest with ourselves that this text has been used and misused in various different ways over time. At its worst, this account has been used as a justification for Christian violence. It's also been used to call into question Jesus' sinless nature. So let's be fundamentally clear. Jesus has not sinned in any way by acting like this. Maybe some people got hurt, maybe they didn't. We don't know. It doesn't really matter. The sin would have been for him not to act. That being said, this is not an invitation for you to go into an establishment you feel might be morally questionable and start chucking things around. We have to remember, Jesus was one with the Father before the foundation of the world. He shares a closeness and affinity with God, the Father, that we can't even begin to fathom. And he walks into his Father's house to find it reduced to a den of robbers. I think the phrase, "what would Jesus do?" is a great one to remember, but it doesn't necessarily apply to every single facet of his life and ministry. Jesus was a carpenter doesn't mean we should all go and take up woodwork. Jesus walked on water is not an invitation for us to take a stroll across the local duck pond. Jesus was almost duty bound in this situation. But what I'd like to suggest is that the act of Jesus cleansing the temple is not so important for us as the significance of the reason behind it. A reason that we should absolutely take on board and try to adopt. So if you trawl through all four Gospels, and if you cherry-picked all the occasions where Jesus seems to act kind of aggressively or forcefully, you would find that on almost every occasion it's for the same reason. Not exclusively, but more often than not, what gets a reaction out of Jesus is corrupt authority. Particularly when corrupt authority leads to the suppression, the marginalization of disadvantaged people, of people in need, of people incapable of looking after themselves. So when Jesus walks into the temple and surveys what's going on, what does he see? Pilgrims everywhere. People that have come hundreds of miles, poor, dust-covered, hungry, thirsty, probably spent their last penny just to get there. Can you imagine what it was like for them? After days and weeks of traveling, through danger and difficulty, no doubt, and they finally come upon Jerusalem. They see the Temple Mount looming in the distance, the very symbol of God's presence on earth. Perhaps some of them broke down and wept, and they finally managed to push their way through the crowds and enter the temple courts, and what's waiting to receive them? Corruption, evil, spiritually bankrupt people. And you can't come in here with your dirty Roman money. If you're going to pay the temple tax, you're going to have to go and get it changed. Don't worry, we'll change it for you, provided you can cover the massively inflated exchange rate. Oh, did you not bring anything to sacrifice? Oh, what a shame. Well, lucky for you, we've got some dove salesmen in the corner there. I'll be happy to sell you a dove to sacrifice, provided you can pay for it, of course, at a massively inflated price. Doves that were specifically reserved in the Old Testament as the cheapest possible option for the poor to be able to be included in the sacrificial system, in the temple worship. Distorted, inflated, used as a means to boost the temple coffers. It doesn't get much lower than exploiting someone's desire to get close to God for monetary gain. How dare they? How dare they? Jesus walks in and says, take your doves, take your tables, take your filthy money, take your pots, your pans, take the kitchen sink, get out. Get out of my Father's house. Jesus, who came to earth specifically to make a way for people to get close to God, to be our mediator, our representative, and he walks into the temple to find the exact opposite. One big fat no entry sign, unless you can pay for it. How could he have reacted in any other way? And I guess at this point it'd be remiss of us not to ask the question, do we restrict people's access to God? Not through extortion or questionable business practices, but through what we say and how we act. There was a lovely man called Mark McGowan who was at the church that I went to as a younger man. He was a kind of seasoned missionary, spent a lot of time in France, and he used to have this expression that always kind of stuck with me. He'd say, as Christians, we want people to come to Christ, but we also expect them to come to us. I.e., to fit in with us, to act like us, to adopt our culture. Only then can we accept them. If Jesus cleansing the temple teaches us anything, is that he will severely hold to account those who put extra conditions on access to God. Now that's not to say that anything goes, that God doesn't place expectations on people, but he invites people to come to him with what they have, not with what we think they should have. And my prayer for all of us, including myself, is that we adopt this same heart of removing barriers to him that don't necessarily need to be there. So moving on, very brief third point. Skipping ahead slightly to verse 20. In the morning as they went along, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. Peter remembered and said to Jesus, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered." "Have faith in God," Jesus answered. "Truly I tell you, if anyone says to this mountain, 'Go throw yourself into the sea,' and does not doubt in their heart, but believes what they say will happen, it will be done for them. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And when you stand praying, if you hold anything against anyone, forgive them, so that your Father in heaven may forgive your sin." So I said at the beginning that this message is laced with hope that isn't necessarily all that easy to spot from the outset. The fig tree is dead. Jesus is declaring the demise of the temple system. But strangely, he then decides to flip the script and use the withered fig tree as a positive illustration about prayer. And what I think we see in this little section, in a very kind of condensed way, is almost like a synopsis of prayer, if you like. Prayer as it was intended, prayer as it is at the time of writing, and prayer as it will be under Jesus' new covenant. So Jesus quotes Isaiah 55 when he declares the temple is supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations. That's prayer as it was intended, as God intended it. But that's kind of been ruined by the suits running the temple, and now the different nations have to pay to pray. Effectively, the temple's lost its heart. It's no longer producing fruit. That's prayer as it is at this point. So what happens now? What's prayer going to look like from this point on? How can people communicate with God and share a relationship with him? Verse 22, have faith. Jesus says, "Come to me. Ask whatever you want." In keeping with God's will, that is. It's about your heart rather than what's in your wallet. Verse 25, don't hold grudges when you pray. Forgive each other. This is how Jesus has designed prayer under this new covenant that he's bringing about. There's a lot of scholars and sort of Bible historians that will tell you that the mountain Jesus refers to in verse 23 refers to the Temple Mount. I don't know if we can say that for certain, but there's others that will also say that moving mountains was kind of like a common rabbinical metaphor for doing something that was supposedly impossible. Either way, the point is the old system is on its way out. This institution that we talked about, this one that no one thought could be replaced. Elsewhere in the Gospels, Jesus says, "I'll rip it down and build it again in 3 days. I will be your temple. You will know God through me. You will pray to me in faith, and there will be nothing to stand in your way. No amount of money changers and dove salesmen can block your access to me." There's some beautiful verses from Jeremiah chapter 31, which I think illustrate this quite nicely. It says, "This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, 'Know the Lord,' because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sin no more." Jesus is the image of the invisible God. This is what we have. This is what we still benefit from, what we're the continuation of. And how often do we truly contemplate this blessing? What a thing it is to be able to approach God in faith through Jesus. Not to need animals or sign off from corrupt bureaucrats. This is what was beginning at the time of Mark chapter 11. So finally then, just a quick point of application. Fast forward to the present day, 2026, Christchurch, Castleford. How are we going to apply this? What are we going to do with it? And I kind of tried my best as I was prepping this week just to kind of take a step back and ask myself as simply as possible, without any sort of preconceived ideas, what is this text saying to you? The withered fig tree, the cleansing of the temple. And what I found made me quite uncomfortable, if I'm being perfectly honest. There's an uncomfortable question which I think this text presents to us. We've kind of skirted around it already. You know, the Lehman brothers, they appeared successful but had hollow, rotting foundations. The fig tree had leaves but no fruit. The temple had activity, busyness, numbers, but no spiritual substance. What do our foundations look like? If we look beyond the leaves, as it were, under the surface, it's all very well looking at the people running the temple and waxing lyrical about how terrible they were, and not holding ourselves to the same standard. Now, obviously, none of us are extorting money out of pilgrims. I mean, I guess you could be, but it's unlikely. But it's much more of a possibility, I would suggest, to fall into a more general kind of spiritual hypocrisy, to appear busy, spiritual, holy, humble even, whilst under the surface the truth may be very different. We like to be our own spin doctors, don't we? We work hard at our PR, even as Christians. But how many times has it been proven true that someone you thought was virtuous or spiritual or humble is hiding some kind of skeleton in the closet? And this type of thing can creep up on us, can't it? You know, do you think that the money changers and merchants in the temple woke up one morning and suddenly decided they wanted to be a bunch of complete rotters? I very much doubt it. But a little bit of penny pinching here, a few little tweaks to the Talmud there, a bit of moralizing and self-justification, and all of a sudden there's a full-blown extortion racket in the temple. Not many of us start out wanting to be morally compromised or sinful. And the Bible teaches us clearly that we have to check ourselves spiritually, because we can drift and wander. And if we're not careful, suddenly what we are and what we appear to be can be very different. So if I were to lift the lid on your life, as it were, what would I find? I know what you'd find if you were to lift the lid on my life. A lot of things I'd be very ashamed for you to see. You know, don't be fooled by the fact I'm stood up here preaching, or that I help run the youth group or whatever else. You would not see anything close to moral perfection if you knew everything about me. This doesn't stop us wanting to keep up appearances though, does it? I hope this isn't oversharing. I'm just going to give a very quick illustration, which I've checked with a couple of people and been given the green light. Most important one being my wife. She's all right with it, so don't panic. But myself and Holly, my wife, we got into a little bit of an argument a few weeks ago because she wanted to go out with one of her friends for the day, and if she were going to go away with this friend and do what she wanted to do, this person didn't have any childcare, so I would have to look after their children. What? I got to the punchline yet. And I sort of, I wasn't feeling, I'm getting my excuses in, I wasn't feeling very well. I was struggling a bit. And I just sort of said to Holly, could we postpone and do it another day? And she went back to this person and said, Joe's not feeling massively up for it, can we postpone and do another day? And that's the point I got annoyed. Because yes, I'm a bit of a miserable git. Yes, I didn't want to help out, but this person wasn't supposed to know that. I wanted this person to think of me as, yeah, I'll look after your kids anytime, which is complete nonsense. But I was worried about my public image, about how I was perceived. Pathetic, really. We get so protective about our public image, don't we? About what people think of us, and I know I'm not the only one. Something many of us wrestle with, I'm sure. I'm sure there's other examples that you can give me, but ultimately what I see of your life or what you see of mine doesn't really matter, does it? It's Jesus, the inspector of the fig tree, who looks behind the leaves behind appearances to see if there's fruit underneath in our lives. The Word of God judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart, Hebrews chapter 4 tells us. So what's the million-dollar question then? Is it not what kind of fruit is Jesus looking for? Is it secret moral perfection? Is he watching to see if you find someone's wallet on the street and go and hand it in, even if no one else sees you? I'm certainly not advocating for stealing anyone's wallet if you find it on the street, and I'm certainly not saying that God doesn't have moral standards. But I don't think, first and foremost, a closet free of skeletons is what Jesus is looking for. If I can borrow another kind of horticultural reference from John 15, when Jesus speaks on the vine and the branches, what is the evidence of our fruitfulness from this text? Verse 5. If we remain in him. This is the point. This is the crux of it. Yes, if we lifted the lids on each other's lives, we might see things that would horrify us by worldly standards. Our closet might be brimming with skeletons. But it's not the first principal thing that Jesus is looking at. Jesus is looking for a life marked by dependence. Dependence on him and what he's done for us. Through his sacrifice on the cross, through his resurrection, through his establishment of this new covenant that no longer needs a temple, this is what we depend on. If your life is marked in this way, God says, I'll take all those skeletons, all those things that you're frightened of people finding out, and I'll take them as far as the east is from the west and remember them no more. That's not to say they don't matter. It's not to say we should keep on stacking them up. The cost for Jesus to pay for them was heavy. Justice was satisfied at the highest possible price. But the point I'm trying to make is that all our goodness and our obedience, whether private or public, is useless if it's not rooted in him. And our motivation to be holy, to be good people, even when no one's watching, needs to flow from this. I'm going to quote John Piper. I'm sure I've quoted this before, so apologies if I have, but he compares the human heart to an onion. And what he means is that if you're going to look internally to see if you're fruitful or if you're good enough or if you're moral enough, you're just going to keep peeling back layer after layer. You're never going to get to the heart of it. You're never going to get that affirmation that you're looking for. The only way that we can have assurance that our fruits are acceptable to God is by looking outwardly at him and knowing how dependent we are on him, knowing that apart from him, we can do nothing. I'm going to finish by quoting a hymn, which again, I know I've quoted before, but I'm not that imaginative, I'm sorry. It's called Come Ye Sinners Poor and Needy. It says, there's a verse in it that says, let not conscience make you linger, nor of fitness fondly dream. All the fitness he requires is to feel your need of him. The fig tree withered because it had no fruit. The temple system ended partly because of the corruption and greed under the surface. Not 40, 50 years after Jesus spoke these words, it was gone, reduced to a pile of rubble by the Romans. But my prayer for all of us here today is that under the surface of our lives, that we produce good fruit, but only because they've grown from the soil of Jesus' love for us.